Welcome to Human Monsters. The Armenian Genocide has often been referred to as the hidden Holocaust. This quote is from the Holocaust Encyclopedia. Sometimes called the first genocide of the 20th century, the Armenian Genocide refers to the physical annihilation of Armenian Christian people living in the Ottoman Empire from spring 1915 through autumn 1916. There were approximately 1.5 million Armenians living in the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire in 1915. At least 664,000 and possibly as many as 1.2 million died during the genocide, either in massacres and individual killings or from systematic ill treatment, exposure, and starvation. Ottoman authorities, supported by auxiliary troops and at times by civilians, perpetrated most of the persecution and mass killing. The Ottoman government, controlled by the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, also called the Young Turks, aimed to solidify Muslim Turkish dominance in the regions of central and eastern Anatolia by eliminating the sizable Armenian presence there. Mass atrocities and genocide are often perpetrated within the context of war. The destruction of the Armenians was closely linked to the events of World War I. Fearing that invading enemy troops would induce Armenians to join them, in spring 1915, the Ottoman government began the deportation of the Armenian population from its northeastern border regions. In the months that followed, the Ottomans expanded deportations from almost all provinces, regardless of distance from combat zones. Today, Armenia is a landlocked nation bordered by Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Iran. People have lived there for thousands of years, and speculation has it that it may be the setting represented in the Old Testament as the Garden of Eden. Scientists have found evidence of some of the most ancient human civilizations there. Armenic Sumerians believe, due to records kept for over 4,000 years, that it is one of the oldest centers of human civilization. Back then, it was a much larger settlement and a target for the Persians. Armenia was first mentioned in Greek records in 7th century BCE. Its tribes were conquered by Alexander the Great in the year 331. It rose to a more prominent position in the 1st century under the rulership of King Tigranes II. However, after his reign, it was conquered again in 55 BCE by Rome. Armenia would remain under Roman rule for centuries. It was, however, ruled by its own king and was permitted to be marginally independent. It was often used as a battlefield by the Romans in their struggles against the Parthians, ancestors of modern-day Iranians. A Parthian king overthrew the Romans in 53 CE. This sparked a tug-of-war between Rome and Parthian over Armenia's territory. A Roman king made a peace gesture by crowning Parthian leader Tiridates, the first king of Armenia. He would also be a vassal to Rome. He was only able to rule with the help of Diocletian, a Roman emperor. Tiridates III was embroiled in feelings of resentment toward the families that arranged for his father's assassination. They would later be penalized for their roles in the conspiracy. He did maintain good relations with one of them, Grigor, known to English scholars and historians as Gregory. The story of St. Gregory the Illuminator factors heavily into the history of Christianity. As lore has it, he was nursed by a Christian woman who raised him from infancy and brought him up as her own son. When Tiridates III retook the throne, Gregory was so racked by guilt over what his father had done, he decided to atone for his father's sins. He decided he would accomplish this by bestowing the greatest gift his father could have given the country, Christianity. Tiridates was not receptive to this idea. He was a pagan and expected his people to adhere to the pagan faith. Gregory refused to do so, angering Tiridates. He had him tortured and dropped into a prison known as the Pit of Oblivion. Nobody ever returned from such a bleak existence in that hole. This didn't satisfy Tiridates. He was enraged that anyone would so much as suggest that Christianity be practiced in his country. With a little help from Diocletian, he launched a campaign of persecution against the Christians in his land. The king descended into an undiagnosed but nevertheless obvious mental illness as Gregory continued to languish in the pit. Gregory was found to be alive and sane. He was brought to the king and prayed for him. After saying the prayer, the king's madness suddenly cleared like a fog at sunbreak. This legend was explained to whoever was gullible enough to believe it so often that it led to the king reneging on his plan to wipe out the Christian population and the religion itself. Hence, in 301 CE, Christianity became the official religion of Armenia. It was the first country to cite Christianity as its official religion and would continue to do so for the next 13 centuries. They were fiercely proud of and unfailingly devout in their faith for centuries, and it went unchallenged. That is, until the Persian Empire's Sassanid dynasty attempted to take over Armenia in the year 451 under the directive of their ruler Yazdegerd II. The Sassanids adhered to the Zoroastrian religion and were determined to force it on the Armenians. The Armenians weren't having it. They broke their collective feet off on the Sassanids' asses. Throughout the subsequent 2 centuries, the Armenians repelled attacks by 2 empires, the Byzantines and the Persians. In the 9th century, Armenia reconsolidated its independence as the dust settled in the emergence of the Middle Ages. They even provided a safe haven for crusading military units heading toward the Holy Lands. However, starting in the 14th century, the Armenians faced invasions and attacks from Muslim societies, especially the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was like all other Muslim empires in that it believed fervently in jihad, the notion that all non-Muslims must be conquered. The Ottomans overcame the armies at Constantinople, which would go on to become modern Istanbul centuries later, the capital of Turkey. Throughout hundreds of years, the Ottomans battled the Persians, claiming portions of Armenia's land and invading its territory as unwanted guests. Despite all this, Armenia remained resolutely Christian and spoke its own language. They were still oppressed by the Turks, though, treated as inferior and even subjected to cruel treatment. Still, they had their basic rights as citizens and were even eligible for positions in government. something arose in European political circles and across the world, the so-called Armenian question. The Ottoman Empire was still not extending them all the rights to which they were entitled. Religious and linguistic minorities always chafed against the government's treatment of the non-Islamic. Their reluctance to improve their approach to religious and linguistic diversity had a lot to do with Russia. The Ottomans hated Russia, which was both a Christian nation and a military threat. The Ottomans feared that the Armenians would become loyal to the Russian government, despite a lack of evidence that it would transpire. The empire's ruler, Abdul Hamid II, was terrified of Russia. That and his greed would become critical liabilities for the Armenian people. He had good reason to fear Russia. Unlike the Ottoman Empire, Russia was a well-oiled, mean military machine. It didn't hurt that they had England as an ally. Britain was a seasoned colonizer and exploiter of other lands and cultures, so they could have done a lot worse as far as allies go. Hamid sought an alliance with Germany. This was not to be because of the Congress of Berlin. It was where the notion of the Armenian question was formally introduced. Hamid had no intentions of placating the Armenians. In fact, he decided to embark on a campaign of oppression. The Armenians weren't about to take this sitting down. Two Armenian factions started up rebel political parties. Most Armenians did not lend their support, but this conglomeration was enough to strike fear into Hamid and his administration. He began by calling them cowards and a terrible threat. Hamid considered Christian Europe to be to blame for all his problems. He characterized the Armenians as a dangerous group that, quote, might tear out our very guts. He was asked by a journalist in 1890 about the Armenian question. He said, "I will soon settle those Armenians." It was an ominous and prophetic statement. (1894). A posse of Kurdish brigands invaded his empire and wreaked havoc. He did nothing to stop them. Instead, he gave them arms and redirected their focus. They were to torture the Armenians. He reassured them that whatever they did would be designated legal. Those men were known as the Hamidian Regiment, or the Hamidi. They drove off livestock that belonged to Armenians. They invaded their homes and tore them asunder. They raped the women. Anybody who stood up to them was slaughtered. When the powers of Europe heard about the massacre, they decided that something had to be done. They sent Hamid a reform package, demanding that the carnage be brought to an end. He was defiant, saying, "This business will end in blood." October 1st, 1895, was the deadline for the Ottoman government to bring about reforms to benefit the Armenians. The deadline was not honored. The Armenians were misled into believing that they could find refuge in Harput, Turkey. Instead, that was where Ottomans launched their attack on them. They fired cannons. They destroyed houses. They massacred individuals, families, and groups. Homes, churches, schools, and all other buildings where Armenian Christians were known to congregate and sought refuge were forced to flee as they watched them burn. The survivors of the fires were butchered savagely. Throughout 1894 and 1896, the period known as the Hamidian massacres yielded approximately 40,000 casualties. Armenians were murdered all over the Ottoman territory. Anywhere they lived, they were killed in cold blood. Piles of corpses were left on the street, picked bare of money and valuables. Many were mutilated, some were burned, others shot, some drowned. They were thrown into mass graves. In many cases, an Armenian family's patriarch would be murdered so that the family would have nobody to earn a living for them, and they would starve. The massacre ended in 1896 with an estimated death toll of 300,000 people, more than a quarter of the Armenian Christian population before it started. Among the survivors, many were forced to convert to Islam. Nevertheless, many clung to their Christian identity, albeit discreetly. For 30 years, Abdul Hamid, known as the Red Sultan, due to his genocidal population management techniques, was strongly disliked by both his citizens and the European powers. However, nobody could stop him from doing whatever he wanted. One conglomerate that were not in league with the Ottomans ideologically was the Young Turks. They formed the Community of Union and Progress, or CUP. They were forward-thinking and determined to usurp the monarch who had oppressed and persecuted so many. One of the organizations that aligned itself with CUP was the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, their leader being Khachatur Maloumian. The Young Turks had a vision of liberty, equality, justice, and freedom. 4 things the Armenians desperately needed and yearned for. Maloumian wanted to restore the constitution. He intended to involve an army, if necessary, to accomplish this objective. He felt that all citizens, regardless of their religion, race, or creed, should enjoy equal rights. He knew Hamid would not be accommodating, so he began to devise a revolution. Hamid put himself at a disadvantage because when he found out his own military officers were discontented with his rule, he made several pervasive cuts to the military, which left him and his armed forces in a vulnerable position. Eventually, his military staged a non-violent mutiny against him, and he knew he no longer had their support. Celebrations rang out in the streets of Constantinople. Albanians, Armenians, Jews, Greeks, Turks, and Arabs partied as equals. The celebrations would be short-lived. The city of Adana roared with fires set by the Ottoman Empire. It was a counter-coup. It was revenge for the success of the Young Turks in reinstating the parliament. Religious minorities were overjoyed that they would not be forced to convert to Islam. The Young Turks were not concerned with any particular religion, only with the freedom to practice any religion that an adherent chooses. The government established by the CUP would be entirely secular. Muslims were not pleased. More tensions arose when Christians were permitted to bear arms, which had not been allowed for centuries. Many Christian leaders encouraged Armenian Christians to take up arms in case Hamid exacted revenge. Many such leaders encouraged their Christian soldiers to retaliate regardless. Hamid was terrified by the prospects of this, and he assembled supportive Muslims and executed a counter-coup on April 13, 1909. It was a success. The Young Turks were dislodged from their positions, and for 10 days, Hamid struck out with violence against the Armenians. He wanted to make it abundantly clear that the Christians were a threat and the Armenians must be exterminated. The Armenians were empowered by the little taste of freedom they enjoyed, so when news about the coup reached Adana on April 14th, they erupted in an angry and violent riot. The Muslims were afraid that they were coming for revenge, but the riot was really just an explosion of outrage from a demographic that was tired of being oppressed and persecuted. Nevertheless, the Muslims rose up and engaged the Armenians in combat. About 2,000 Turkish lives were lost, 5,000 Armenian lives were lost. About 2,000 Turkish lives were lost, 5,000 Armenian lives were lost. The European powers sent ships and military personnel to bring about an end to the conflict. By the end of April, the Young Turks reclaimed control of the government. Despite that victory, the Red Sultan's last horrific massacre of the Armenians yielded a death toll of 20,000 to 30,000 Armenians. To this day, the government of Turkey denies that the Adana massacre ever happened. The CUP decided to unite the country under the leadership of Abdul Hamid's brother, Sultan Mehmed V, though he was really just a figurehead. This situation presented a problem, for the government just wanted to unite all peoples in the land as Turks. But they weren't all Turks. As previously stated, there were Armenians, Arabs, Albanians, Jews, Greeks, and among many other minorities. In comparison to the Turks, they spoke different languages, observed different religions, practiced different cultures, and embodied different identities. Even amid widespread massacres, they clung to these things. They were now disheartened when informed they would have to identify as Turkish. The CUP referred to a new process of absorption called Turkification. All the people, Turkish by birth or not, would be assimilated into the Turkish identity. It was a betrayal after the initial promises made by the Young Turks. The three leaders of Turkey were now Mehmed Talat Pasha, the Grand Vizier, Ismail Enver Pasha, one of the first military commanders involved in the Young Turk Revolution, was the Minister of War. Ahmed Tajemal Pasha was the Minister of the Navy. They believed that Turkification would lead to power and unity for the Ottoman Empire and establish security for the general population and power for the triumvirate. There was no unity. Only conflicts emerged between the Turks and the minorities. According to government propaganda, all non-Turks were inferior and dangerous. As a result, native Turks came to despise the minorities, and the Armenians refused to become Turkified, especially when it came to converting to Islam. Three ways in which they were discriminated against were higher rates of taxation in comparison to Turks, denied fewer privileges than the general population, and the official language of the courts and other institutions was Turkish, which the Armenians did not speak. The minorities appealed to the countries from whence they originated, hence the Balkan War. It was a short but bloody war and a reminder to the Turkish government that forced assimilation of the minorities was a fool's errand. October 28, 1914, the Ottoman Empire signed on to participate in World War I to fight alongside Germany. This led to Muslim authorities in Turkey to declare jihad on the non-Islamic population. The government had even successfully convinced the secular community that they were a threat. The Turkish government stripped them of all arms out of concern that they would align themselves with Russia, who was an adversary of the Turkish government during the war. This was true of all weapons, even kitchen knives, anything that could be used for self-defense. Enver Pasha had attempted to engage the Russians in battle, but suffered a humiliating loss. He blamed the Armenians, though his own incompetence was more to blame than anything. April 1915. Life was only getting worse for the Armenians. Gangs of violent thugs formed and attacked the defenseless Armenians, and the police did nothing to stop or prosecute these assaults. The Armenians fled to the city of Van, where the attacks continued. They engaged in bloody hand-to-hand combat with the gangs. Thousands of people died, but eventually the conflict subsided. April 19th, military commander Jevdet Bey ordered the city to submit 4,000 men for the labor battalions. This was a ruse. The Armenians knew full well that he only intended to kill that much of the Armenian population. To fend him off for the time being, they offered 500 men and some exemption money. Bey refused. He neither wanted soldiers nor money. He wanted to be compensated in blood. Making himself more clearly understood, he declared that he intended to kill, quote, every Christian man, woman, and child in the city. Bey had 5,000 soldiers at his disposal, and the Turkish army would have provided part of their 60,000-member army if deemed necessary. April 20th. An Armenian woman was heading to Van. She was stumbling across the countryside as a living casualty of war. She was beaten, traumatized, and exhausted. She was so desperate for the asylum she hoped she would find in Van that she ventured too close to some Ottoman soldiers. They grabbed her, molested her, and pushed her to and fro. 2 Armenian men witnessed this from within Van and couldn't take it any longer. There was nothing they could do unarmed, however, and they were both shot. Bey interpreted this scenario as the ideal excuse to launch an attack. He launched the Siege of Van, though through the prism of propaganda, it has been dubbed the Defense of Van. The Armenians managed to keep Van open to refugees, though thousands of refugees were murdered. It was not technically legal to kill Armenians in Van at the time. An official act of persecuting Armenians was passed by the government. It was the day after the invasion of Constantinople when Turkish police and soldiers arrested 235 Armenian intellectuals. They were informed they no longer had the right to be citizens of the Ottoman Empire. They were also told they would be held in cells before being dispatched to the Syrian desert. Many other Armenians were rounded up under similar criteria. They were forced out of the city. May 17th, the siege carried out against Van continued. Some relief forces arrived from Russia and brought the situation under control. Thousands of Armenians were forced across the Syrian desert as they were roasted by the summer heat. The destination was the township of Deir ez-Zor, a small community that was not equipped to handle an influx of so many displaced people. This did not concern the Ottomans. A new law was passed by the Ottomans. It was called the Tesur Law. Simply put, it enabled Ottoman officials to deport Armenians without trial or investigation and at their own discretion. Any Armenian person who was considered to be a threat to national security, basically. However, for most Armenians, simply being Armenian served adequately as criteria to deport them, whereupon they were arrested and sent to the Syrian desert to die. As they made their way across the desert, conditions were brutal in other ways than the relentless heat. Very little food and water was provided. Many of the soldiers who were conscripted into the armed forces were sexually frustrated after leaving behind girlfriends and wives. They took this out on many of the Armenian women, and in many cases, they raped them in front of their children. Married women were raped in front of their husbands. In many cases, they were raped repeatedly by multiple men and then left on the ground for dead. Others were sold into sexual slavery in the cities. Fathers, brothers, or other males who stood up to the soldiers would be beaten, shot, or stabbed. Some families were herded into cattle cars on trains and transported across the desert. On the train, there was no food, water, or washrooms. The conditions were deplorable, and sickness began to spread. Those who were forced to walk had to do so no matter how old, tired, or disabled they might be. If they could not keep up with the comparably well-nourished soldiers, they would be killed by sword. Killing with a sword was a means to traumatize the witnesses. Thousands of them died of dehydration. It was not uncommon to find themselves greeted by the sight of dead Armenians by the side of the path, decomposing and or being fed upon by scavenging animals. Others were tossed in mass graves. One such grave contained 60,000 corpses. The trauma affected many of them after having been stoic and well-adjusted for most of their lives. Only 45,000 of the displaced Armenians made it to Deir ez-Zor. At the time of these events, the word genocide had not yet been coined, but a term was fostered that offered up just as much clarity: race murder. The telegram had been invented, speeding up text-based communication that left letters outclassed. With this new communications medium, information about the genocide graduated from the trickle originating in the Middle East to a tidal wave by the time it reached American shores. As with many other nationalities, Americans were shocked, appalled, and outraged by what the Armenians were suffering through. The American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief was assembled and received an endorsement from President Woodrow Wilson. In response to the bloodshed, many Americans donated whatever they could to the relief effort, while others volunteered their time and services. The Ottomans were surprised that Americans would go as far as Deir ez-Zor to offer alms to the Armenians. They were not moved by these gestures, however, and were still determined to wipe out the entire Armenian race. When Ali Bey watched the displaced Armenians file into Deir ez-Zor, he was dumbfounded. Most of the survivors were children. The remainder were women. The survivors were starving, dehydrated, and sick. Most of the men were killed by Ottoman soldiers along the way. The children were gaunt, with sunken eyes. It was as if, by walking through the desert, they were slabs of meat left to overcook in an oven. The traumas they endured personally and as witnesses burned the life out of their eyes, leaving them sunken and blank. They were skeletal, with their skin stretched over their faces. Their teeth protruded behind chapped lips. Their only possible source of nourishment was the lice that crawled about their heads. They were unwashed and in a race against decay. Ali Bey was compassionate enough to set up refugee camps in a cave. He took in 1,000 orphans and provided them with food, water, shelter, health care, and some protection. For a time, the Armenian victims of the Death March began to recover. Within their camps, some trade began to take place. They revived some of their cultural traditions. Ali Bey's superior, Abdul Halik Renda, was outraged by the day-to-day business in what went on in the refugee camp. He told Bey that allowing thousands of Armenians to live peacefully in that location was, quote, an instance of disagreement with the sacred goal of the government. To drive home the point further, he said to Bey, expel them from that place. The so-called sacred goal was to wipe the Armenian race off the face of the earth. Bey said to his superiors, the means of transportation do not exist so that I could deport the people. The means of transportation he was referring to were the feet of the displaced Armenians. Bey just could not bring himself to force those people through the desert again under identical circumstances. Indeed, in a telegram, he spelled it out more explicitly. If the goal being pursued is to kill them, I can neither do it nor make it done. The government's response was to relieve him of duty. The government replaced Ali Bey with Zaki Bey. Ali may not have had the stomach for torture and genocide, but Zaki was already licking his chops. He was a heartless psychopath rendering the horrors of war. He enjoyed murdering soldiers by the thousands. He was about to kill thousands of Armenian refugees. He would have jumped in a time machine to travel back to an hour before he was commissioned just to re-experience that moment. He was impatient to make death preferable to life as he slaughtered thousands of Armenian lives. Hence, food and water were denied. Beatings and rapes were administered. The survivors were cast out of the camps and left for dead in the desert. Thousands of children starved to death. 1,000 orphans Ali Bey housed personally were thrown out on the street. Many of them starved to death naked in the gutters. At a riverside location, Armenian children's hands and feet were tied and they were tossed into the river, where they were left to drown. Whether it was because they grew bored with the efficiency of death delivered by guns, or it seemed that such a method offered too much mercy with a quick death, they were drawing upon their own inner sadism. Hence, the Armenian children were exterminated by all new means. Sometimes they were doused in gasoline and set afire. The orphans in particular were subjected to that torture. If they weren't burned alive, they would be drowned. Beheaded children floated in rivers. Sheiks would molest women among the endangered Armenians in search of a wife. 5,000 Armenians were tied together to be burned within a pile of burning grass. A politician ordered doctors working at a hospital that was treating Armenian refugees to inject them with typhoid-tainted blood. At the time, a healthy individual could survive typhus, but not someone who endured something as horrific as the Armenian Death March. For such people, it was generally a death sentence. At the same hospital, children were given lethal doses of morphine. Samal Azmi was the politician who ordered the hospital executions, but he was growing impatient. He wanted more deaths, and he wanted them yesterday. People were taken to docks and told they would be transferred to another location along the Black Sea. They didn't question it and climbed aboard the boats. The ships came to a stop en route. Women and children were tossed into the frigid waters of the ocean. They appealed for mercy as they attempted to climb back on the ship, but the crew tossed the children back into the ocean, laughing as they did so. The water was so freezing cold, it led to paralysis, especially since so many of them were weakened by starvation. Thousands screamed as they drowned. Azmi came up with a way to exploit the Armenian orphans. He made them sex slaves. After having done their tour of duty, he would have them killed. As many as 10 children at a time suffered this fate. He gave his son 13 of the prettiest Armenian girls as a gift. It didn't just happen to orphans. Many women and children were forced into sex slavery after being stolen from their families. The girls would be raped and then assigned positions in the harems of the worst of Turkish men, men who occupied prestigious positions in society and who delighted in torturing the girls. When they were placed in Muslim households, they were stripped of everything that had been a part of their Armenian heritage, their language, their faith, all aspects of their culture. They were restrained as Muslim tattoos were carved into their epidermises. They lived as slaves in these households and were forbidden to own property. Not that they had any rights anyway. There were exceptions, however. Some altruistic Turkish men married Armenian women so they could escape the genocide. Many Armenian parents gave up their children voluntarily to save them from the genocide, though while they were not killed, they were indentured into domestic servitude and raped in harems. One man was remembered as owning a harem of 12 underage Armenian girls. Meanwhile, the government and the military went on a gluttonous feeding frenzy as they seized the Armenians' money and possessions, pecking it clean to the bones. The value of the properties alone would be $300,000 US when adjusted for inflation. The British invaded Turkey and the Ottomans were helpless to resist, so they surrendered. The Turkish minister of the Navy, Rauf Orbay, escaped to Germany. He knew he faced charges for genocide. The signing of the Mudros Armistice formally acknowledged the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and surrender to the British Empire. The Ottomans were forced to surrender all the Armenian prisoners to the Allies. 400,000 Armenians remained after all was said and done. 1.5 million had died. Though it was mostly soldiers who did the dirty work for the government during the genocide, many civilians assaulted, murdered, stole from, and raped women and children just as often. Many were living in houses and profiting from businesses that had once belonged to the Armenians. At the trials, the so-called three pashas, the three Turkish political leaders, whose influence throughout the genocide was the most catalytic, were found guilty and sentenced to death. There was an additional Turkish-Armenian war in 1920 when the Armenians who remained took up arms. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk became the new leader of Turkey. He deported Armenians, though his decision was more motivated by a desire to make Turkey into a secular society. There were only a few hundred Armenians left in Turkey. The rest had fled to other nations, where they were free to practice their faith and cultural traditions. I'm going to leave you with a few quotes about the Armenian Genocide. First one is by Anatole France, French author, 1916. Armenia is dying, but it will survive. The little blood that is left is precious blood that will give birth to a heroic generation, a nation that does not want to die, does not die. The next one is by Fridtjof Nansen, Norwegian public figure, 1915. The massacres that started in 1915 have nothing to compare with the history of mankind. The massacres by Abdul Hamid are minor in comparison to what today's Turks have done. Jacques de Morgan, French scientist, in 1917 said, "The deportations of Western Armenians are nothing but concealed race extermination. There is no language rich enough to describe the horrors of it." Valery Brusov, Russian poet, said in 1917, "Turks continued their previous policy. They would not stop committing massive and most awful massacres that even Lang Timur would not dare do." Fayer el-Hussein, Arab publicist, said in 1917, "Who can describe the feelings that an eyewitness experiences when he thinks of this heroic and unfortunate nation? Its courage and spirit surprise the world. A nation that yesterday was one of the most energetic and progressive nations of the Ottoman Empire is becoming a memory." Joseph Marquardt, a German scientist, said in 1916, "Even after proclamation of the Constitution, the main slogan of the Turkish policy has been, 'Without Armenians, there will be no Armenian problem.'" Henry Morgenthau Sr., the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Ambassador Morgenthau's Story, 1919, when the Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and in their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal the fact. I am confident that the whole history of the human race contains no such horrible episode as this. The great massacres and persecutions of the past seem almost insignificant when compared to the sufferings of the Armenian race in 1915. Ronald Reagan, U.S. President, April 22, 1981. Proclamation. Like the genocide of the Armenians before it and the genocide of the Cambodians which followed it, the lessons of the Holocaust must never be forgotten. George Bush Sr., U.S. President, April 20th, 1990, speech in Orlando, Florida. "We join Armenians around the world as we remember the terrible massacres suffered in 1915 to 1923 at the hands of the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. The United States responded to this crime against humanity by leading diplomatic and private relief efforts." John Evans, U.S. Ambassador to Armenia, said to American Armenians on February 19, 2005, "Today I shall call this Armenian Genocide. I think that we, the U.S. government, owe you, our fellow citizens, a more straightforward and honest discussion of this problem. I can tell you, as a person who has studied this problem, I have no doubts about what happened. I think that it is inappropriate for us, the Americans, to play with words in this case. I believe that we must call a spade a spade." Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.